Hello, all, and welcome back to a new episode of Movies and Us, a weekly gathering place filled with conversations about movies, stories, and connection. My name is Jennifer Hahn.
And I'm Sarah Callan.
And today we're going to be reviewing the classic film, The Princess Bride, and we are joined by a very special guest, Andrew. Andrew, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. So, again, thank you so much for having me on, Jen and Sarah. It has been a pleasure to get to know you on social media, and I have been clamoring to eventually join your show. So I'm very humbled by this opportunity. So thank you both to begin with. Again, my name's Andrew. I'm the creator and host of a podcast called the Revisionist Almanac. And what we basically do is we go back into past Oscar ceremonies and we look at all the award winners, and then we wipe the slate clean. We give our own nominations and we let people vote on what should have won in a particular year. And so it's a lot of fun where, you know, we take deep dives and then we have an interactive content on social media. So a lot of fun all the time.
It is so fun. And with the Oscars being such a staple of where there's eyeballs and attention for films, love that you're rewriting history for us all. We're all better for it, you know?
Yes. Yes. Though it does drives me crazy the amount of movies I have to watch and prep every month, but that's life.
Oh my gosh, yeah, that's so true. I didn't even think about that aspect of it, but yeah, but you're so informed, you know, in some of the classic big films of each year. So a lot of work, but
and you'll be joining soon enough next year, so
yes.
you'll get to take a 1 month deep dive, and we'll see how that goes.
We'll get to see what it's like to be you, to have to prep for those episodes. It'll be good. We'll really be able to empathize.
Exactly.
Okay, well, Sarah, do you want to kick us off with an IMDb summary for The Princess Bride?
A bedridden boy's grandfather reads him the story of a farm boy turned pirate who encounters numerous obstacles, enemies, and allies in his quest to be reunited with his true love.
All right. And in Movies and Us tradition, we always start off with a one-sentence summary. And Andrew, do you want to kick us off as our guest and share your one-sentence summary for The Princess Bride?
Okay, I feel like there's a lot of pressure here. This is a big movie. It means a lot to me, but I've been thinking on it. I think I've got one. Okay, so my one-sentence summary of The Princess Bride is: this film is proof that fairy tales aren't just for girls.
Oh, I love that. Yeah.
I think that, especially in the 80s, it was like, you know, very stereotypical to, like, there was boy things and there were girl things. And, you know, I kind of grew up in that time period. And so it was nice to have this movie and kind of let you go, oh, okay, like fairy tales, you know, that like there's enough in there for a young boy to get into. Whereas, you know, traditionally people would just think fairy tales are for young girls and things like that. So this is really that first movie for me that clicked in that way.
Wow, that's awesome. Especially with the title like The Princess Bride. It's got girl written all over it.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But there's a lot more to it. Okay, Sarah, what is your one-sentence summary?
Okay, in honor of Fezzik and his great rhyming abilities, my one-sentence summary is: a fantastical tale that never grows stale.
Well played. Well done.
I didn't have the bravery to try a rhyme, so very impressive.
I was either going to rhyme or include inconceivable in my one-sentence summary, and the rhyme was easier.
I've got you covered, because to deny the magic of storytelling would be inconceivable.
Well played.
I'm glad one of us got it in there. It had
Yes.
to be in there somewhere, right?
Oh, all right. Well, we are going to dive in to talk about this movie. And it came out many decades ago. So if you haven't seen it yet, we are giving you a spoiler alert. Please check it out and inform yourselves into a staple of culture and a beloved film for so many people. All right. So before we dive into the actual talking about the film itself, this is a film that I think is going to be really fun to hear about what each of our relationships were with this film before going into this watch of it. Did you grow up with it? Are you in the cult that is in the following of this film that is loyal and quoting the lines left and right? Where do you fall on this in the world of the Princess Bride's fandom? Andrew, let's start with you.
Well, I feel like I'm going to probably date myself. I something tells me I'm the oldest person in this room right now. I'm 38, so I'm kind of the movie came out and I was very young. I don't think I remember my first experience with the movie. This, for whatever reason, The Princess Bride and Ghostbusters are the two movies from my childhood that I just kind of feel like they were always there. And I at some point as a kid, maybe it was my parents, maybe it was me, I remember recording it on VHS on basic cable. So like you still had the commercial breaks and all that stuff. And I remember just wearing out the VHS tape back in the day. And so this movie's just kind of always lived with me, and I don't ever remember a point in my life where The Princess Bride wasn't there. And I don't know if that's unique to, me being born in the mid to late 80s or what, but that's definitely, this movie's the sweet spot. It's like the warm blanket.
Sarah, what about you? What is your relationship to The Princess Bride before our most recent watch?
Yeah, I feel kind of similarly to you, Andrew. My parents growing up loved this movie, and so we owned it. They watched it all the time. What's funny is, as a kid, it terrified me. I was so scared of the fire swamp and the ROUSs that I refused to watch this movie. I was so traumatized as a kid. So it wasn't until I was an adult and I revisited it again that I was like, oh no, this is amazing. Like, child me was just wrong. So I was then initiated into the love of The Princess Bride, and that's where we're at now.
Nice. And before this watch, I was on the other side of the spectrum of, I always felt like people love this movie. Bring this movie up in conversation, and you just see people light up, like their eyes get all crinkled in the edges, and they feel the warm and fuzzies, and they absolutely adore this film. And I always felt like I didn't like this movie. I think while this watch, I was like, I wonder why that was. My theory is, I remember my first time watching this was in after school at school, and I must have showed up late to the movie because I did not have a lot of the context of what was happening. And I think I showed up during the scene where Wesley's being tortured, and I went, oh my gosh, I don't think I like this movie.
Of all the spots to walk in it,
the worst possible spot. And I think there's also just a lot of like context missing that makes the second half of this movie, you're just like, what is going on? Why are these like really big, colorful, larger than life characters bopping around on screen? And you have just like very little context. So I was like always terrified to review this movie. I hadn't revisited it since because I was like, I don't want to hate on this movie that everyone loves. And I understand the appeal a lot more now that I am rewatch this again. I can see so clearly why this film means so much. And I've been thinking a lot with this movie about what is it about it that makes it so iconic, and what makes a film in general so iconic, because this movie means so much to so many people across generational divides, across types of people. Like, there's something about this that is just got a warm, soft spot for the masses. And so that's been really fun to think about and ponder. It definitely has like a cult following as well. So I was like, I don't really get it. I don't understand. But I've been really now informed and I've seen the light now. I've come to the light side.
It's been crazy because leading up to this episode, I was throwing stuff up on my social media pages asking people what their opinion of the movie was, because I wanted to get kind of a baseline for kind of what you're talking about, Jen.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating because, like, no matter what age you are, your gender, your sexual orientation, anything, it seems like this movie just kind of clicks for almost everyone. It's one of those rare movies where it's just this comfortable movie that everyone has kind of grown up with and gravitated towards. And it was just really interesting to see all that feedback, because I think only one person that I talked to said anything negative about the film. They were very passionate. They were very passionate about not being into the movie, but by and large, most people seem to be really into The Princess Bride. It does have a full cult status, like you said.
Mm-hmm. And it's really interesting because you have the people that are like fully like leaders of the cult. You know what I mean? Like they are ride or die for this movie. And oftentimes I think with some film or shows or whatever, there's that group, and then there's, you know, the rest of us that are just living our lives. But this movie, for the masses, ignites this like light that gets lit up in them. And we can definitely dive into a lot of this because I'm curious your theories or kind of hypotheses on like what is it about the Princess Bride that makes it so meaningful for so many people. And like you mentioned, Andrew, across racial divides, generational divides, age groups, like it seems to hold something near and dear for so many people. What are your thoughts about why that might be the case? What makes this film so magical?
Wow, I don't know. It's a great question. It's so hard to answer. And I don't know if this is just, maybe it's just related to fantasy. There's something about the
Mm.
world of fantasy, whether it's the Lord of the Rings trilogy or, you know, a couple of other iconic things that come from the fantasy genre, but it just feels like, because it's not grounded in reality, everyone feels like they can connect with it to some degree because it's more about universal truths than other things. I think that's the only way I can describe it. I'm curious when I need to show my two young children. I've got a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old, and I'm a little afraid to show them too young so they don't end up like Sarah, terrified of this movie. But you know, I feel like they're at that point now where this is probably a good entry point to get them hooked on it, because I feel like if you do see this movie at the right age, it's going to be a situation where you're kind of like me, where it just kind of lives inside of you all the time.
Yeah, I think another piece of it is the types of humor that are in this are really varied, and so no matter what your preferred style of humor is, I feel like there's something in this movie for you, and so when you have all of those different types of humor, no matter what you're into, you can enjoy aspects of this film. And that's really hard to do, to have all of that in one film and have it feel cohesive and make sense. And then maybe another little piece of it is the stars that are in this too. You know, like the second that Peter Falk walked on screen, I was like, yes, this is the best. Like, I grew up watching Columbo. So, like, I was just so happy to see him again. And then, like, Andre the Giant was so beloved, you know? So there's just like these really big stars that people just adored. And now this movie is like, so there's so many gifs, it's so memeable, like it's just in pop culture. So I feel like that's maybe another way that the different age groups can kind of you know, I don't know, bond over their love of the Princess Bride.
Mm-hmm. And the Princess Bride, I feel like also has that interesting like Pixar effect where like there's it works for kids that are watching this and as an adventure story and the shenanigans that our crew gets into. But there's also so much for the adults too, the older populations that are watching this. The dialogue, like I didn't remember, obviously because I was a child watching this, the pit of despair scene. I didn't realize how quippy and witty the dialogue is. And so there's so much there, and conceptually there's a lot of like fun ways that this is obviously playing with the fantasy genre tropes, and there's a lot of satire in there. So there's like plenty for someone just older to sink into and just see how they're playing with some of these tropes that are so familiar to us. So you're so right, Andrew, that there's something around like the fantasy genre that is compelling on its face, but then also it's playing with it as well, which seems really fun too. And kind of that element of surprise in so many scenes where it does the opposite of what you expect it to, makes for it to be really, really fun as well.
Yeah, and I think kind of to Sarah's point too, the comedy doesn't ever feel dated, at least to me.
Mm-hmm.
And it unlike, you know, I'm a huge Mel Brooks fan, but Mel Brooks has a certain type of humor, and you know, the Monty Python guys have a certain type of humor, and if you're not into that, it's hard to kind of find your way into those films. Whereas this movie, even though occasionally like the Billy Crystal stuff, for instance, is kind of one type of humor, there are all these different elements that I feel like universally everyone who's into jokes and stuff can find some way into this movie. So yeah, I think that's a great point, Sarah.
And it's interesting because something that we often talk about with movies is that, you know, we ask this question like, who was this movie for? And when when that is muddled, you kind of wonder, like, one, what's the marketing team doing here, like who's your target persona for this, but then two, things get diluted, right? It's because you can't be everything to everybody unless you're the Princess Bride. And that is really fascinating because there's adventure, there's romance, there's some really philosophical ideas in this. Again, I was surprised by the spread of humor is also so vast, and so somehow it's been able to do everything at once and not have it feel misguided or in conflict or muddled in any way or diluted in any way. And that is really, there's something that is working in perfect balance in this movie that I think is really interesting too.
Yeah, and I think rewatching this, I rewatched it 3 times in the last week because I really wanted to kind of let it wash over me. I'm notorious for doing that kind of stuff, but it was just a reminder to me that the 80s felt like the perfect decade for making films like this that really captured a wide audience. I think this, The Goonies, Back to the Future, there are E.T., there are multiple movies in the 80s genre that really did a nice job of capturing a young adult audience, a kid's audience, an adult. Like they had a big, wide umbrella that they cast, and I just really appreciate movies in the 80s. Nowadays, everything's kind of so segmented and for a specific audience. It's hard to find a movie nowadays that kind of hits in the way a lot of these 80s classics do.
One of the other thoughts as I was like ruminating on this the entire time watching this movie and afterwards, of like, what is it about this like magical spell that the Princess Bride has had for us? But one of the things that I think is really key is that it taps into something within us that like believes in the child in us. You know what I mean? Like, one of the questions that I jotted down here that I'm curious to y'all's thoughts on is like, does this movie work as well without the framing of it? The framing of a grandfather reading to his grandson, a little boy, you know, and how that shapes the way that we view the story. And I had, again, forgotten that piece of the framing of this. So when the movie started, I was like, did I click the right movie? Like, am I watching the right movie? I just didn't remember. I probably like missed it as well the first time. But I was also surprised at how much we cut back to the grandfather and the grandson. I thought, you know, you start out, you know, Disney does this all the time of like, once upon a time there was a girl, and the storybook opens, and then we don't revisit that until the very ending shot, but we're constantly cutting back to the grandfather with his son and his questions, and there's a whole arc there as well of the little boy coming to like really love and be captivated by the story. And so do you think this movie works without the framing, and does it work without it being a grandfather too, is another question that I had. So
I don't think this movie works at all if it's just what happens in the book, if you will, because like when I was younger and watched this movie, I could identify with Fred Savage's character.
mm-hmm.
I'm a huge Wonder Years fan as well, so I've always kind of been into him growing up or whatever. So I always identified with him. But now that I'm nearing 40, I've got 2 young boys myself, I've started to see myself slowly turning into the grandfather character reading to a young child. And so rewatching it now kind of put this whole new spin on things where it's like I can see my young boys doing similar things to what the grandson's doing. It's really fascinating to kind of see the evolution of my life through the Princess Bride. I think that's a very necessary point to the film.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think one of the reasons why that framing is so helpful too is because we cut back and forth. And I love that moment when when Buttercup is trying to escape off of the ship and she's swimming and there's the giant shrieking eels, and it's this moment of suspense and we're like, oh no, is she gonna get away? And then we cut back and we remember that it's a story. We get to see the grandson's reaction. We get to have their little banter, which is just so fun and funny. And then we go back in, but the grandpa doesn't get there. He doesn't pick up at the right spot. So then he has to we fast forward through what he already read, and then, oh, we're back into the action again. So I loved that moment in particular because it is scary, but I think that cutting away helps remind us like, oh no, it's just a story. We don't need to be too scared. So it maintains the appropriate amount of tension, and it uses the right amount of humor to cut that tension. It was just so masterfully done, that cut in particular.
Yeah, one thing I also really noticed about it was Rob Reiner never goes out of his way to like try to hide the fact that it's a movie and that there's like elements of like you can see the set effectively, you know, in certain spots, and like it's not trying to be more than what it is. And I think that's kind of a an interesting approach to it where again it's like you just said, it's you're reminded like, okay, this is a book. We're sort of reading a story. It's not really happening in front of us necessarily as reality. And so I just kind of like the idea that Rob Reiner wasn't afraid to sort of play with the idea that yeah, you're watching a movie. You're watching a movie, a movie inside of a movie, kind of in a way.
It also helps it age well too, you know, like when the unusually large rodents in the forest show up, you're like, oh yeah, this is how it would look in like inside of a little boy's brain, I'm sure, you know. And so when
Right.
they look like clearly like animatronics, it's just really funny too. If anything, it garners that, like, it endears us to the movie more instead of us coming from this lens of like, oh, you know, technology's gotten so much better now, so that doesn't look as good. We're like, there's a whimsical aspect to it that gets woven in there. I was also fascinated to see how the dialogue between the grandfather and his grandson was like oddly getting at these very real truths through the reaction. So I particularly love the one where the little boy is like exclaiming like, it's not fair that she ends up with Humperdinck and not Wesley. And the grandpa says, who says life is fair? And then we just keep moving on, and you're just like, hold on, I just got smacked in the head with some real life truths through this really sweet little moment. But it really gets at the power of stories to reveal truths about reality and the way that stories shape and open up our perspectives or teach us things or inspire us with things. And it was cool to see that there's that little moment, but the movie is also smart enough to not dwell too long there, and it just keeps it moving because it knows that we're on to the next adventure and turning the page of the story.
Did either of you, I'm curious, did either of you read the book at any point in your life? I personally never have. And my wife is a huge fan of the book, and she was kind of telling me about it over the last couple of days. Have either of you read the book?
No, I have not.
No, I haven't. I heard that it was different than the movie though, but I might be wrong.
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, and I'm just taking my wife's word as Bible, and she's definitely the reader of the family, so I'll trust her. From what I understand, it's kind of told through the grandson's point of view, except he's older now and he's remembering the story, and he's sort of writing down the story as he remembers it, and so there's like cliff notes for kind of his memory as he's telling the story, and it's supposed to be a really fascinating read because I was curious like how much did Rob Reiner transition exactly from the book, and it sounds like he did a pretty admirable job getting most of it across. But yeah, this is watching it multiple times this week has made me decide I think I finally need to read this book now. I've how have I not seen it or read it in 30 years since I've been watching the movie? I don't know.
Yeah, it would be fascinating to compare where he chose to focus. That's always really fun to see, and what he thought would work well on the big screen versus in story format. Um, Speaking of books, I was thinking a lot about The Notebook while watching this movie. On the while we're talking about this framing piece, because it's kind of genius. It immediately frames the story as something that is timeless and is able to withstand the test of time, and it really like primes us as the viewers to go into it with that lens. So I just thought like that was just a really interesting like choice, because you know people often say The Notebook is this like timeless, you know, the love story of all time, and I think there's something there around that framing, and it's done so well that it works, and that sense of distance is actually healthy for us to buy into the fact that this is the love story of all time, you know, that we go into that with that framing already versus we end the movie with that conclusion afterwards. So I just was thinking a lot about the framing of The Princess Bride while watching this.
It tells you what it is. It sets your expectations of, okay, we are going on this journey. Here is your roadmap. Let's go. And then it delivers on all of those things that it promises too, which is like why I think it works so well. It's because it sets it up. Love story for the ages. And then we see just how much they have to go through to realize that love story for the ages. Because if like yeah, they love each other, but like nothing happens to them and they don't ever have to like overcome anything, then why is that the love story for the ages? So I appreciate that it frames it, it sets the expectations, but then it delivers on it.
And it certainly helps that the chemistry between the two leads is palpable from the very beginning. I mean, you immediately, and from what I understand, Offset, they were quite smitten with each other as well. I mean, you can sense it between the two actors. They're you know, I think that carries through a lot, is just the unbelievable chemistry they both had.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. At the beginning, you're like, I don't even care that they have not spoken words to each other because, like, you are the love story full time, you know? They've only spoken 3 words to each other, but you're like, I buy it. I buy into it immediately. I'm curious for both of you, uh, and maybe especially for you, Andrea, that you've watched this so many times. In this watch, what were some things that maybe you didn't notice or you really were more captivated by on this specific most recent watch that was maybe new discoveries or new dimensions of the film that you found particularly interesting?
I think that just having watched so many movies this year for my own show and prep, I've seen a lot of these actors now kind
Mhm.
of pop in more. And so it was really fascinating to see like Wallace Shawn, who plays Vizzini, and he's a really phenomenal actor. And it was interesting. He was just chewing up all of the scenery. Everything he's in just was, you know, he was just having a blast with the script, obviously. And so it was really interesting to see him. I think Andre the Giant stood out more to me. I mean, I've been a pro wrestling fan since childhood. I was again a kid of the '80s, so obviously I got into that, and so I remember Andre the Giant and everything. But yeah, it was just amazing to see how much love he had for what he was doing there, and I think that watching it now as an older viewer, it was just it was more interesting to see the actors as
Mhm.
opposed to in the past. I just always was kind of absorbed with the story and everything at that level. But you know, seeing Peter Falk, like you mentioned, Columbo, Sarah, it was just interesting to see how specific Rob Reiner was with all of these choices in the casting, and they really came together in this wonderful, harmonious way. Because casting is kind of a crapshoot, you know. You're rolling the dice, and sometimes you get it right, and sometimes you don't. And this movie just has that kind of perfect concoction of the right people in the right roles.
And it is wild to think about like how many stars there are in this movie. Like phenomenal, and you can just go down the list and think about so many iconic films or even TV shows that these actors have gone on to be in. And it's so cool to revisit this and see, you know, them in this context. I've always loved the Inigo and Fezzik relationship. They're so much fun, and I just enjoy seeing that all over again. And it's so lighthearted and it's so fun. And it's funny thinking about like Mandy Patinkin, you know, he was in Criminal Minds for a few years, and that's a very different character. But to come back to this time when he is this, you know, revengeful swordsman who is also so much fun, it's just a blast to see these characters all over again.
And somehow they're all so charismatic. You know what I mean? Like I think sometimes in films you've got like your one or two that are really stealing the screen, but they all hold their own so well, and every scene that they're in seems to pop. And I think that is like a rarity as well. You know, for that full stack cast to all be delivering, having the most fun and all compelling on screen is kind of rare. And so there's this kind of maybe perfect storm of stars aligning for this film as well, and they're all delivering uh, top notch performances. And you know, there's like great performances, and then there's like charismatic performances, and I think all of them are in that second category. And there is something different about it when the charisma is there as well for the roles that they're playing. And so I think that is really palpable in this movie. Sarah, I'm curious for you, are there things that really stood out to you in this watch as well?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I was maybe paying more attention to this time, because I when I watch this movie, I tend to think of it as like almost like a buddy comedy between Inigo and Fezzik, because they're just my favorite and like everybody else is just kind of a sideshow. And I think I was a little surprised at maybe how little Buttercup does in this movie. I think I was really hoping, especially because like Robin Wright is such a powerhouse of an actress. Like I was hoping for a little bit more from her. And so it's just so interesting to watch this again and just see she's not given a lot to do, even though she is the titular princess bride. And so that kind of surprised me, because I mean, maybe that's why I tend to not pay attention to her when I watch this movie. But yeah, she a lot of times is just kind of standing there. I'm like, man, I want so much more for you, Buttercup. Like, you can still have a love story for the ages, but you can also contribute. It's okay.
But she also somehow has so much more agency than like most of the damsel in distress princess characters that we typically see in this type of story too, which is fascinating. It's one of the ways I think that the movie's playing with that. She makes choices and advocates for things and whatnot and is waiting to be saved, but like has some sass, which is really great. So I think like both, well, in general, I think all of these characters break the natural stereotypes while also fulfilling them in a lot of ways, which is an interesting balance that is happening here. You know, like the scene that I found really funny is that when Wesley and his crew are like breaking through to save the princess, like he can't walk, you know, and that totally breaks that stereotype of like the valiant prince that storms through to sweep you off of your feet because he's strong and mighty. Like he's being dragged by Andre the Giant through the hallways. And so the satire of this film is really, I think, like really compelling. And it's so different from a lot of the satire that I think is more common, especially now, that I think is a little bit more cynical and a little bit more aggressive in trying to like break down these concepts that exist or tropes that exist. This one's just like playing with it to have fun. And I think that was also something that was really interesting about this film that I really noticed this time.
Yeah, Rob Reiner really hits the sweet spot in terms of he was just coming off Stand By Me prior to this movie, which is another one of those movies that has this great ensemble, a really good cast. A couple of years later, he does A Few Good Men, another big ensemble piece with a lot of really talented actors. Rob Reiner's just really he was operating at a really high level at this particular point in time, and he had done Spinal Tap already, so he had the ability to do comedy, but also add the dramatic elements to it. And he had this perfect balance that helped the tonality of the film in a lot of ways. And it's just a reminder to me that Rob Reiner was one of the great directors of the 80s and early 90s for that run he had. Harry Met Sally in there too. I mean, unbelievable stuff he was cranking out.
Yeah, how did he do that? Like, have so many like amazing movies right in a row. Like, wow, impressive.
It's one of the great
Yeah.
runs ever.
Yeah, that is insane. You're rattling them off, and when you hear them all together, you're like, oh my gosh, like one home run after the next. That's insane. But you're right. One thing that they all have in common is they somehow are playing with common concepts that are so familiar to us, but then also, like you're mentioning, striking the right balance, like not leaning so heavily into making fun of them to the point where it is totally silly. You know, it's not Monty Python and the Holy Grail, right? There's something that's the heart of this film and the dramatic heart of this film that's so common in fantasy stories is still there somehow. And how do you craft that balance where you don't lean too heavily in one side or the other, where it is that very self-serious fantasy love story and battle story or whatnot, to the other spectrum, which is everything is silly and ridiculous. It's somehow capturing back and forth constantly between the two of those things and from scene to scene and even within the same scene too. So I thought that the scene where Wesley, like, we don't know if he can stand or not yet, like it's capturing the emotion and then yet like lets the air out of the balloon too right after. But that emotional moment is what we've been like waiting for, is this valiant moment, and then it kind of turns. So that constant like turning back and forth within a scene, throughout the film. It's just so smart. It's so well written. It's insane.
One of the other things that just stood out to me every time I go back to this movie, you finally get to the big moment when Inigo has found Rugen and he's ready, and then Rugen like runs away like a coward. And I had just recently watched The Grand Budapest Hotel by Wes Anderson, which is in the last 10 years, and there's a scene almost identical to that where Ray Fiennes is about to get captured and he like sprints off into the background, and it was just this hilarious moment of like the Princess Bride has such an influence now that every movie, all these movies are kind of playing with things the Princess Bride did, and it was just a reminder to me, like this tiny little moment. It's like, okay, even in 2014, Wes Anderson's basically ripping off something that the Princess Bride did right there in front of you. Just amazing how much influence this movie's touched for 30 years.
That was one of my favorite moments. It's so good. The perfect example of the like, it builds up and the movie knows we have an expectation of what's about to happen because it's also shown us these really epic sword fighting scenes throughout the movie. So we're like gearing up for it, and that element of like, we know what you wanted. We're not going to give it to you, but we are going to give it to you like 2 scenes later, which is also interesting too, right? Like we get the big epic sword fight. It's just not in the hallway. And so,
Right.
yeah, that constant switching back and forth and then seeing the influence of that in film history. I love that comparison that you made to The Grand Budapest Hotel. The impact of this film and its roots that have been built on and continue to multiply throughout film is incredible. And I think Sari mentioned this earlier, like pop culture, the memes, the GIFs, the quotable lines, so present.
And I think that's what also helps this, have kind of the legacy that it does, is because it is so quotable. And I mean, even when I was watching it again, there were lines when I was like watching it and I'm like, oh yeah, I'm saying the lines along with the characters because they're just lodged in my brain. They're so iconic. So then it feels like, it feels homey. It feels comfortable because you've seen this before, and like we've talked about, the characters are also charismatic, and there are tense moments, there are scary moments, there are dramatic moments, but it's never too much to make you like too uncomfortable to want to revisit this. So it really does strike this perfect balance between everything to make it one of the most rewatchable films, probably. I mean, it is. I don't know how you get tired of this. There's so much to enjoy every time you rewatch it.
Yeah, 3 rewatches in a week was not a problem at all, trust me.
And I hear that same sentiment from so many people too. They just throw it on because it's like that warm safety blanket. And there's also likely the nostalgia with it as well, of like you, Andrew, growing up with this film and it being such a staple of your childhood, that it is nostalgic and also familiar all at the same time. And I think those quotable lines, and also I think the larger than life characters help contribute to that too. There's something about like sitcoms that are that comfort blanket for a lot of people too. And I think it's those big character personalities that when you're with them again, you're with them again. You're back in their presence. You're hanging out with all of these big personalities. And so there's something about that I think is also fascinating. And also you can just pick up wherever and you kind of know exactly where you are in the movie too, which helps. It doesn't need like the full experience from beginning to end, but you got to pick up and fold your laundry, have it on in the background, cook, whatever it is,
This was definitely one of those movies where, like back in basic cable days, you just be like channel surfing and then it's on, and it doesn't matter what scene it's on. You're there for however much time is left in it. This was for sure one of those movies for me.
And I think that actually is a good point, because this came out in at the perfect time, like when cable was a thing, and that's how we consumed our media. If The Princess Bride came out today in the world of streaming, I don't know that it would have had that same kind of staying power. But because it seemed to be on often on cable, and so you would just pop in whenever, and you could hang out with your friends, and it was just kind of always accessible and always kind of around, and that probably helped make it have the legacy that it has today.
Yeah, because I mean, it was only about 15 or so years ago. There was a film that came out called Stardust, which is a fantasy film. I'm a big fan of it, but it like nobody has ever really seen it. It never gets talked about, and it's kind of in the same vein as Princess Bride, where, like you said, if Princess Bride comes out in the 2000s, it just probably gets lost in the shuffle. It was that it didn't do particularly well at the box office. It really found its legs in that cable window for people my age who were just, right age, right time. It was exactly, it came out exactly when it needed to come out, for sure.
And I wonder if there's also something about like the subject matter and the like pacing and arc of like how we go from scene to scene that is palatable. Like I think about other like iconic big films, and there some of them are big and dramatic, and like there's something about the Princess Bride that's feel good and comfortable that is different from like a, I don't know, Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, like these iconic franchises that you sit down and you go on a whole like adrenaline run experience for. But the Princess Bride has this kind of pacing to it, and the subject matter itself feels like you can just, it's there, you don't have to like sit down and like prepare yourself for a journey or like a final big battle war scene in Lord of the Rings. Like there's something that's um easily accessible about this too, that maybe makes it easier for you to reach for it. Similar, it's very. I didn't really think about this too much, but it might be interesting, Mullen. Like the similarities to the way that sitcoms have that same effect. Like there's something that's um, rolling about the way that it unfolds, and there aren't these like big dramatic spikes constantly that makes it feel like I could just throw that on and reach for it. Put on Gilmore Girls, put on Friends, put on Seinfeld, and you can pick up wherever in the whole storyline. And there's something that's palatable and accessible constantly, and also feel good, that maybe also contributes to the rewatchability for the Princess Bride as well. Is Princess Bride a sitcom? No, I'm just kidding. Does it have more in common with sitcoms?
I had never thought about comparing it to a sitcom, but like I'm somebody who will just turn on The Office without even thinking about it, because it's just like I know I don't have to, my brain doesn't have to process too much for a couple of hours if I just want to watch it at night. And The Princess Bride is very much in that same vein. So that's a really interesting analogy you made that I would have never thought about, but I think there's a lot of truth to that.
It's interesting to like think about too, like how to capture, if you had to, like to distill down the Princess Bride into its elements. Because if you're a film studio executive, right, you're trying to figure out how to like what is magical about this and recreate it, right? And so, and what is it about like us as people that buy into this with such mass appeal, like these? Because a film like this doesn't come often. We get one of these like maybe in a couple of years, and then the lasting power like this maybe once in a couple of decades, right? So what is it about this perfect alignment of components and ingredients that have made this beautiful thing that has stayed so long and will continue to get passed down in the same way? And then comparing this with some of the films that are coming out now and what the differences are is like a really fascinating concept. And what will be the film of like our generation that will be the Princess Bride for like our kids and our kids and our kids next couple of decades. What will be the Princess Bride is also an interesting thing to think about, and why. So anyway, lots of like fascinating things, but I think there's something that is inherently hopeful about the Princess Bride that also is, it makes it so meaningful too. Like the way that obviously our two main characters fight for love, they fight for each other, the way that Inigo is fighting for his family and honor for his family, like these universal truths. I don't know who mentioned it earlier, it might have been you, Andrew, but those universal truths that speak to everyone, that is really the staple of like all stories ever, but has been perfectly all captured here, that we just want to root for the hero. We want to root for the love story. We want to root for the family honor, and then we want to root for the silly shenanigans of our group of friends. Like staples of every story that has been told in human history, and they've somehow done it all here.
Yeah, the movie just kind of exudes positivity and joy in a really, I don't know, old fashioned's not the right word, but it's like you just don't see it a lot anymore. But it's just, I don't know, it's such an elegant way to tell a movie and just make it, like I said, it's so joyful. Like I can't help but watch The Princess Bride and just smile throughout the whole film because like you can tell that they're all having fun on set. I think that translates through the screen. All of the characters, I think, generally they're all good natured. Even like Humperdinck, he doesn't die like some horrible death. He's just kind of like, okay, I'm just gonna let her go off and live her life, kind of thing. It's just kind of like passed to the wayside or whatever. Like there's not these huge stakes involved. It's relatively small scale, which is nice. It's refreshing.
So maybe, Miracle Max, he creates a miracle to bring Wesley back to life, but maybe he created a secondary miracle, which has allowed this movie to have, many decades of staying power. Could this be Miracle Max's number one miracle?
Sarah, I think that might have been your best take ever on the pod. I'm going to take that nugget with me forever. That was a gem. Well
That's
done.
getting cut out as like a social media reel, I can tell.
Yes. Okay, another question for y'all. There was talks of doing a remake. How do we feel? Would we want that? Do we not want that? Are we like, how dare you? That would be criminal. Don't touch what is perfect. Or are you intrigued to see what they might do with a modern, updated version of what The Princess Bride could be in this day and age? What are your thoughts?
I'm gonna let Sarah take the lead on this one. I'm curious what she has to say.
I don't want that. Get that out of here. Nope. Take it away. Mm-mm. I am Inigo Montoya standing at the top of the cliff, and I am not going to throw down the rope to this sequel. Nope. I don't want it. Andrew, do you have a different opinion?
I wasn't going to be so harsh with it, but I'm glad you went full board to the extreme there, which I appreciate. Generally, I'm someone who's pro remakes and sequels and prequels and whatever. Like I don't think a remake necessarily diminishes what came before it. I just kind of fall in that camp. I can usually separate the two, and I'm always kind of curious to see what comes from it. However, I would say there are probably a handful of films that sort of feel untouchable to a degree. They're perfect, and it doesn't feel like there's a necessity to touch it. I would put this, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, which is another one that people always kind of circle like, oh, we should do a remake with Timothy Chalamet or whatever. And it's like, I don't know. Do we need it? I don't know. And the Truman Show is another one that kind of comes to mind. There are just a few that I feel like they're so meticulously crafted, and there's not a single thing I would change about it. And I don't feel like time has left it by the wayside. And so this would be one I would just say, maybe we could keep not touching it. That would be great. But the studios will do it at some point. It's inevitable. That is sort of the nature of Hollywood, and if there's a buck to be made, they'll probably try it. But I would prefer not. It would kind of make me sad, I think.
It's that awkward moment where you're watching a movie and it makes you just want the other one. You're just like, I'm here, I'm sitting here, I'm steeped into this like uncanny valley. Like, why is this weird? Like, this is the same world, but it's not the right one. It's like when you're in your dream and you're like, I know this is not real. And this, I don't think this needs a remake. And I think that like this is so beloved, and especially with the actors and the stars, like we've talked about, really like are so iconic in those roles that I don't know how he would do. If I were an actor, I would, don't cast me in this movie, please, because you're just setting me up for disappointing audiences because they're gonna want and they love and they're tied to and attached to the original. So I don't think this needs one, and I don't think there's new things that potentially could make this more interesting. There's not like new technology that we have to make the scenes in space look better that would warrant something that could, truly add to the world building of this. I think, and I think this is like already such pure text that you would just taint in some way. They recently did a Mean Girls remake and added a bunch of like new like Gen Alpha, Gen Z lingo and concepts in there as perhaps a way to, endear themselves to a younger audience. But I think the Princess Bride's one that's likely passed down within families and something that's kind of special for the family to experience together. And so I don't think it has any risk of being forgotten in a specific time and place.
And it's still so easily accessible on Disney Plus. Like, so yeah, it's not one of those movies that's like hard to find where it's like, oh well, let's remake this so people can find it suddenly. Like when you type in, I think all you have to do is type in PR on Disney Plus, and it's like the first thing that pops up. It's not hard to find, and my kids could probably get to it pretty quickly at this point. So there's no need for another one.
Agreed. Okay, any other last big thoughts about Princess Bride before I have a final question for everybody?
One thing I will say, and it caught my attention on a rewatch, is I think Billy Crystal's hilarious in his one scene, or if it's a couple of scenes, but whatever, that little moment when he's Miracle Max. Apparently he was so hilarious on set, and as Billy Crystal's known to do, he was basically improvising most of his work. Rob Reiner and Carrie Elwes, who plays Wesley, they both had to leave the set because they couldn't do a take without laughing. And so there's actually a dummy in place of Wesley in the scene because they had to like separate them from the set because Billy Crystal was just cracking everybody up. And I just thought that was amazing. And I'm a huge Billy Crystal fan, and like you can tell he's just like he's throwing 100 miles an hour. He's given all of his comedy best in that scene, and it's hilarious. And I love that he was like cracking the director up and everything. Just unbelievable.
They're like two children that are like just goofing off, and you're like, we need to put them in separate rooms now because you're causing a ruckus.
Right.
And we're trying to, I guess, get the shot. That is so funny.
And it's hilarious as the director. It's like you're in charge and you still have to like be separated.
Okay, before we wrap, I would love to hear about everyone's favorite scene. Do you have a favorite scene? Is there a scene, if you don't have a favorite scene, because I know Sarah hates the favorite question of any kind because she's like, I can't choose. So perhaps a scene you particularly loved this watch is also another way that you could answer the question, where your joy spiked significantly compared to some of the other ones.
I'll jump in real quick. I would say if I had to pick one, it's probably the Battle of Wits, because I mentioned him earlier, Wallace Shawn. He's just like, he's having so much fun, and he just goes on this huge dialogue run. I can't imagine, like the memorization of that had to be pretty fun because he's just talking so quickly and so fast, and it's funny how much is involved in his thought process for which cup has the poison in it. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what he chooses, because Wesley's sort of outsmarted him by, spoiler alert, getting himself sort of accustomed to the poison. And I just love that Battle of Wits scenes because it's just hilarious dialogue.
And I love that when he dies, he like freezes and just falls off, like out of the frame. It's so good.
Yes.
Some great cinematography choices right there. Sarah, what was yours? Or if you need more time, by all means.
There's so many good options. So I'm going to answer your question by kind of like not answering your question. So get ready for my kind of non-answer / answer.
You always do this.
I know. You give me like one path and there's like only one way to go, and I will find a different way to go. I don't know why.
This is true.
I'm so sorry. So anytime Peter Falk is on screen, I'm just happy as a clam. He perfectly embodies just like a grandpa that you just want to hang around with, but he's also so snarky and witty at the same time, and he just has this sharpness to him that I love. And then at the end, when he gets up to leave, he's like checking his pockets like he forgot something. And to me, it's such a grandpa thing to do, but it's also such a Columbo thing to do because Columbo was always kind of disheveled. He didn't know where anything was. He was this kind of bumbling detective. And so I don't know if that was intentional, but it made my heart so happy. And then I'm going to give a second answer because I'm going to. And it's all of Fezzik's dialogue, basically. He's so funny and so endearing and has great timing. But one of my favorite lines, he has so many good ones, but one of my favorites from him is when him and Inigo are going back and forth with the rhyming on the boat. And Vizzini is so annoyed at the rhyming and he's asking him to stop. And Fezzik's last line is, "Anyone want a peanut?" I love it. It's so funny, so out of left field, delivered perfectly. Timing is great. It's perfect.
I can't tell you how many times I've quoted that particular line. I have multiple people in my life who tell me my deep voice sort of reminds them of Andre the Giant, so it's just natural I would use that line and the dog paddle line every now and then.
So good. You have successfully answered the question. Good job, Sarah. Well done. Gold star for you. My choice, because I jotted it down, so I really was captivated by the scene, was when Inigo is throwing down the rope, and the whole dialogue of Wesley like hanging on the side of the cliff, and they're just sparring with their words. I just ate that up so much, and we get a whole bunch of that for the rest of the film. But that's one that like was particularly so joyful to see. So I love some really, really well constructed dialogue, and there's some good stuff there. Excited to hear, Andrew, that your two kiddos are soon going to get to experience all that this is, and it's going to get passed down soon in the family line. It's exciting.
Yes, they're reaching that age where I have all of these movies that I am waiting to like bestow upon them, and you know we're sort of at that point where we're so kind of deep in like the Bluey world, and there's nothing wrong with that because Bluey is magical in its life. But you know, I'm kind of excited to like start showing them, you know, like the next level up in young adult content. You know, that they've already asked me like when can they watch Gremlins. I don't know necessarily how they know what Gremlins is, but I'm like I don't know if we're quite at Gremlins stage yet, but we're getting there. We're close.
I know they like go to school, come back with all these like new concepts and ideas, and you're like, where did you? What?
Right. They can identify Pennywise and Michael Myers, and I'm like people are going to think I'm the crazy parent because I have not taught you children what these things are yet.
Oh, so good. It'll be an exciting day. It'll be an exciting day when that gets, you pop your popcorn and get all the snacks and put that on. It'll be good. So good. All right. Well, this is our review and discussion about The Princess Bride and all of the aspects that make this film so iconic, so classic, and so timeless. And its far-reaching impacts are indeed so palpable. You can find it available to stream on Disney Plus, and I believe you can rent it on all of the different various streaming platforms and for purchase as well. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Movies and Us. And a big thank you to you, Andrew, for joining and sharing all of your thoughts and feelings and love for this movie. It was a lot of fun. We really picked a great first movie to pod together on. So go us. This is awesome. Where can people find more of you and more of your conversations and work on the interwebs?
Sure. Well, thank you again for having me on. It's been just a humbling experience. I'm a huge fan of the show. 346 episodes, by the way, is crazy. I have no idea how you two do this. Plus the TVs and us stuff. I mean, it's mind blowing how much you all do on the content side. So I am just unbelievably impressed with the two of you. So just first know that. But in terms of finding me, you can find me on all the social media platforms at the handle Rev Almanac. My podcast is on every platform, including on video on YouTube. So we're everywhere, the Revisionist Almanac. Again, we take a deep dive into past Oscars ceremonies. We look at what won Best Picture, Director, the acting awards. Then we kind of wipe the slate clean, and we decide what we think should have been nominated and should have won. And then we turn the power over to the listeners and the social media community to decide what actually deserved the revised Oscars. And I am so excited that Jen and Sarah will both be on the show November of 2025. So we still got a while, but you guys will be on, and we're going to dive into 2003, which is the year the Lord of the Rings Return of the King won. Mystic River came out that year, Lost in Translation. It's a phenomenal year. The three of us will watch so many things in 2003, and then we will talk about it. So I'm really excited to have you two on next year.
Yeah, it'll be so fun. It'll be really fun. I'm gonna start watching them now. Got my lineup going.
I already have people for next year who have been watching movies for several months because they're like, how am I going to get to 40 plus movies? Because that's about what I do every month for my show. Wow. So it's pretty intense.
Wow. Yeah. Incredible. So yeah, definitely check out more of Andrew and the Revisionist Almanac. We'll include all of those links in our show notes, so it's real easy for you to find where he is and where the show is, all the socials, all the goodness, and amazing stuff what they do over there. And you need more of Andre the Giant voice in your life too. I mean, really, come on. Our name, Movies and Us, sums it up. We're all about movies and the powerful ways we can connect with each other and the world around us. This podcast is about all of us and our shared stories, so everyone is welcome here, and we're so glad you spent time with us today. You can subscribe to this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you tune to your favorite shows. Drop us a rating and review, letting us know all of your thoughts about The Princess Bride and your relationship to this movie. You can connect with us on Instagram, Threads, and TikTok at moviesnustpod, or you can email us at moviesnustpod@gmail.com. We also have recently launched merch for the pod, so we'll include some of that in the show notes as well. So check it out. It's been a fun project for us, and to see some of the things that Sarah's designed out into the world. It's really fun. All right. Well, we will be back next week to discuss, honestly, another iconic film, Beetlejuice, in anticipation of the sequel coming out very soon here, Beetlejuice. So come back next week for more classic films. All right. We hope you have an amazing week, and we'll see you again real soon.